Som rada, že ste tu, už je to 12. krát. 12. noc architektúry sa týka témy materiality a svetla a rozhodli sme sa preto pozvať z londýnskeho ateliéru OMMX Hikaru Nissake a k tejto téme vám vlastne povie on sám.
Tak.
Well, I just introduced you, so you can start.
Yeah, that's okay. Hello? Ahoy? Ahoy? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Ahoy. First, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to Archtung, and also, I had an opportunity before kind of speaking here to walk around and see the work, and it seems like it's a really exciting school, so hopefully, this sort of exchange is, I think, really important, and hopefully I'll introduce you to a slightly different way of working, which, we can learn from each other, I guess. Right? The title of this lecture is called Transubstantiate, which is, I know, quite a mouthful and quite a difficult word, but essentially it means to change the essence of something, and it has a kind of Christian kind of undertones, or overtones I should say, because the transubstantiation is when in the Eucharist people eat bread and drink wine, and it's symbolic of the body and blood of Christ. So pretty heavy. But the point of an undercurrent in the work is kind of to talk about how we as designers are imbuing new meanings into objects or things, and that's what we do as design. Yeah, hello. So the lecture is kind of divided into 4 sections. The first is called Meter, and essentially what I want to talk about is challenging the dogma of the metric measurement, the meter, and to rethink how we kind of talk about space and think about space. It's important, like in English at least, it's quite a subtle distinction, but when you talk about the meter of a space, kind of in linguistics, it means something totally different. It means the kind of measure of the space, the feeling of a space, the atmosphere of a space. It's much more complex than simply, hey, it's 2 meters over that way, or 3 meters, or to do with a direct measurement of scale. And so I guess it's more about, kind of what we're talking about is more about the psychology of spaces and how we think about spaces. I included this slide because this was actually when I was still a student. It was kind of one of the first drawings I was doing in my final year, in my thesis year. I thought it might be quite interesting for you because it certainly underpinned a lot of the work in the office. And essentially it was a redrawing of an area of London called Elephant and Castle just through architectural detail alone. So the challenge was to stop thinking about master plans or large areas of city in terms of maps or kind of top-down geographical mapping of places, but to try and understand what constitutes a place. And for us, the case I'm making in this lecture is that it's materials, it's constructions, it's architectural details that speak to us, that help us, enable us to understand a city as opposed to, a plan of a city. So this is, okay, actually along the top you'll see that there are 4 sections that are kind of running along here, so the 4 chapters. But this is the cubit rod, which is a kind of ancient Egyptian measuring device. And the reason why I included this was because what we enjoyed about this, as opposed to a kind of meter rule, was that it was the average kind of measurement of the forearm, from the elbow to the middle finger. And there's a kind of directness in the way that historically we used to measure space or understand space or value space that related to human dimensions, to the body. We really enjoyed this. The next thing we quite enjoyed was the furlong, and how historically areas of agriculture were planned around the furlong. And the furlong was the average kind of length that an oxen, a cow, like an ox, could plow before getting very tired. So what we enjoyed about this measurement was that it was intrinsically allied with the psychological kind of fatigue or dimension of an animal, no? And then kind of thinking about its implications on space. As an office, we often look at kind of references, like artistic references. One of our favorite that we kind of keep on coming back to is Richard Long. We really enjoy the composition of the image, of the kind of scalelessness of this line moving from the foreground to the background is kind of somehow dimensionless, but yet, because of the horizon, we understand a kind of psychological we perceive depth and tiredness, and we understand certain things, but it isn't so direct as if you were to draw it on a plan, let's say. I'm not sure if you know this, we're doing an exhibition for the Royal Academy of Arts in London on Dali and Duchamp, and when we saw this work, kind of it really resonated with us. It's 3 standard stoppages by Duchamp, and it's essentially what he did was he took a piece of string and dropped the string, and then cut the profile of that, of the profile of the string out of wood, and he called these meter rules. And he was challenging the directness of a linear meter, and how when we talk about space, we always talk about the shortest route, the most direct route, and that's how we measure space. But in fact, a meter can in fact loop on itself, and this kind of surrealist kind of phenomena. And then finally, before kind of talking about our work more directly, a very famous image by Aldo Rossi. And the thing that it's been discussed time and time again, but for us, what we really enjoy is the kind of scalelessness of the way he's drawing kind of the material culture, the objects that we find in our houses or in our lives, alongside ruins, alongside, forks and spoons and these sorts of things, and then drawing it in their kind of allegorical map of the city. And we really enjoyed this kind of even weighting that kind of Rossi demonstrates between the stuff that we all collect, that we all have, that kind of the material culture that makes us, in a way, who we are, and architecture, and the symbiotic relationship between the two. And for us, as architects, the last thing we do is we put in the objects that make us who we are, and we talk about space in very kind of abstract terms in terms of the quality of the light, the proportions of a room, or these sorts of things, but is to say, actually, those things are equally important, and we should start with those, almost. So this section is kind of, I guess, illustrating, maybe more illustrative of how that has manifested or kind of within the work in the office. So kind of how a material or construction technique can actually start speaking of a place. And I guess one thing to kind of talk about as well, or to acknowledge, is that because we're a very young office, I mean, I'm 31 years old and we've been going for about 6 years, the scale of projects that we've had access to have been quite humble and quite small. And I guess that has also affected the trajectory and thinking within the office as well, kind of in a passive way. It's steered the work. But I imagine a lot of you who, when you graduate, will be going through a very similar journey. So, I don't know. Yeah. So this project was for the adjoining of 2 apartments that the client had bought just on the Thames, so on the River Thames that carves through London. It had 2 really long balconies along the bottom and the top. One overlooked a body of water called Chelsea Harbour, the other the Thames. And essentially the client bought both apartments and wanted to combine them in one. And he lived by himself, his children had grown up, and he didn't like this kind of compartmentalization of the plan. So he didn't like rooms, essentially. He was saying, I want open plan living. But I guess the problem with the building was it was built by a ferry company called P&O Ferries, which I'm not sure if you have an equivalent in Slovakia. But it's a shipbuilder, and the building was terrible. I mean, it was really poor construction. It was incredibly high-value real estate, but really badly built. And so we kind of started the process by looking at furniture. And we really enjoyed the kind of mechanics and operations of these kind of old furniture pieces. And particularly, this is actually a bidet. You know, it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a toilet. And how, and how kind of historically, when they were kind of first manifesting, they were, you know, in the UK at least, they were hidden into quite ornate pieces of furniture. And we began thinking about how we might use this in a way to kind of choreograph our insertions in the building. So essentially, it became 4 furniture pieces, 2 of which are literally furniture, which are wardrobes, and 2 of which were wet rooms, kind of referencing the bidet, I guess. And then they all operate. So they all kind of have armatures that close off the space, like sliding walls and these sorts of things. So anyway, essentially it's an open plan flat. You can kind of get that. And we're kind of working and constructing models, thinking about what it would be like to live amongst these furniture pieces. And we started exploring marquetry, which is a really traditional way of making furniture, and thinking about, you know, this individual happened to be quite wealthy, so we're thinking about stately homes and frescoes and those sorts of things, and kind of a contemporary reinterpretation of that. And then, of course, the river. So the river is, you know, it's ubiquitous. It almost defines the flat. It's the whole balcony kind of overlooks this. And this is actually a view from his balcony. So that was kind of the plan form, the general principle, the concept, as it were. And then we started really thinking about the material. Like, how do you dress these boxes? How can it start being an intrinsic part of the fabric of the insertions? So at the time we were reading Nan Shepherd, who's this kind of very kind of, I guess, prolific and important author in the UK, and she wrote a book called, well, less prolific. She wrote very few novels, but she wrote a book called The Living Mountain. And what we really enjoyed was the kind of, I won't read out the passage because maybe it's a bit too long, but she's essentially describing how ice freezes in the Cairngorms in Scotland. And I mean, she talks about kind of crinkled green cascades of ice, then a dam forms further up, half-frozen slush, green though colourless, have lifted out. And what we loved was the depth of her understanding of a material that most people just take for granted. You know, it's just water, it's ice, these sorts of things. And then really trying to understand whether we can evoke that within a material palette ourselves. And the second really important reference was Ronnie Horn, the photographer, who produced this incredible kind of photographic survey of the Thames, where she was kind of, what we enjoyed was kind of, through her documentation of the Thames along its length, how she discovered different figuring, different colours, different depths, different transparencies, like all of these things. And we were wondering, and particularly what was kind of interesting, these are kind of quite large pieces of work, was the writing underneath. So she starts also pairing these photographs with descriptions of things that were found or new myths about the Thames. And we like this kind of tension of potentially using a material to start to imbue new myths or mythologies, like a fresco, as it were, or representation within the interior of an apartment. So we started off looking at veneer. Well, in fact, we looked at hundreds of materials, but we ended up kind of working with veneer and looking at how you process a log, you cut veneer, and then how you set it out, or how you could set it out. And then we made kind of one-to-one prototypes. So the middle one is as tall as me. And then did a huge amount of kind of in-house staining and coloring and finish tests. And then we hand-picked 100 square meters of veneer. So every single piece of tree we hand-picked. And then these were cut. So this is the cutting sheet, but not by a machine. These were hand-cut. And then we went to a separate person to commission a bespoke finish, like a bespoke staining and also bespoke finishing of the material. And then finally, these are the finished materials that clad 100 square meters. So hopefully you can start to see, you know, it recalls the things that we're talking about. And so this is, in a way, I kind of regret having taken the photos before the client moved in his furniture, because I don't know, questionable taste, or we didn't really like it at the time. But this is essentially one of the pieces, and you can see the sliding walls that kind of open up. And what we enjoyed was the way that how the material reveals its depth when viewed front on, but when viewed obliquely, like from an angle, it starts to reflect with faint distortions, like water. So it starts to behave like water. And then as you walk through those various boxes or furniture pieces, you get this myriad of different things revealing itself or reflecting the river. And it was always reorientating yourself back to the river, which we thought was possibly the only redeeming point of this apartment. And even kind of the way we were detailing kind of concealed rooms, he kind of wanted secret rooms that were just for him in private, kind of provided kind of fragmented views back to the river. And there were this kind of constant reciprocity between the two. Terror and Wonder, the Gothic Imagination, is kind of another small project that we did for the British Library. It's for an exhibition celebrating 250 years of Gothic literature and the Gothic genre. And essentially, the project became about how we can respond to a certain cultural context and distill that into, again, a really simple constructional logic or material palette. So this is a still from La Belle et la Bête. So we'd kind of start from this, and we really enjoyed how this becomes a trope in Gothic cinema, like constantly. So we're referencing kind of, I should say, early 20th century cinema. And we watched a huge amount of it. And then that became a kind of structuring device for the whole exhibition, which was essentially to display books. You know, it's the British Library, so how we can create a theatrical environment. And then how that material starts to behave, so you get veiled views back and forth between the various sections. And then how the audience also becomes kind of part of that experience, a part of the exhibition. This is Nosferatu, I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's a kind of classic film. And what we enjoyed was this really low-tech means of overlaying kind of two images. And for us, it became quite direct. We weren't allowed to take photos of people in the exhibition because of rights, like photographic rights and signing off consent forms and all of that stuff. But essentially, we pulled up all the display cases. So you've got these kind of fragmented reflections of things behind things or illusory things. And then we were looking at kind of Gothic church plans and thinking about how you structure an exhibition. So this is essentially the main space, and we kind of inscribed a central room that became the 20th century Gothic, and then looked at how, which was one of the reasons of the exhibition was to look at how the 250 years of Gothic became a kind of, I guess, amalgamated in the middle in the 20th century. And then looking at how we detail and plan and arrange that space. But essentially this became kind of the exhibition. And a lot of the challenge was thinking about the material that's in the exhibition. So this is Tintin Abbey by Turner. And then thinking quite simply in really prosaic terms, how we can detail a buttress or a wall to recall those. So for here, or how we can detail them to recall a ruined landscape. So these are kind of the finished things that you walk through and kind of under. And then kind of how you can start to detail various settings. So this is the library, which was the first ever Gothic novel, was actually written in this room. And then how you can kind of start to abstractly recreate those environments. And then also what we enjoyed was how in Gothic architecture, they always present you with a point, you know, like with the windows and the detailing, it's always a point. And then how that starts to manifest, or how it starts to inform how you detail the threshold. And I think that these early projects were really important in kind of trying to understand how a really careful consideration of detail can start to speak of a place or a cultural context, even if it's just 2x4 or, you know, pieces of wood and ply. like how can you manipulate a piece of, or MDF I should say, how can you manipulate a piece of MDF and a piece of timber that you can buy from the a DIY store to start speaking about Gothic architecture? This is still from The Shining, which kind of influenced our thinking of the way we were kind of arranging or planning the space. But yeah, so that was that one. And then you exit through the gift shop. And then talking of shops, we were looking at, so this is a clothes shop. It's quite a famous shop in the UK. And essentially, this clothes shop had a real problem with moths. It's kind of a really strange kind of requirement that moths were eating all of their clothes. And we were looking at Lebanese cedar as a material, which is kind of a natural moth repellent, and also the clothes company really enjoys kind of honest construction from the roots. So we're looking at kind of how a timber log, so how a tree trunk is sliced into various floor planks, you know, to essentially to become a building material. And we were just thinking, how can you detail a single plank of wood to hold and display clothes? I mean, it's quite prosaic, it's quite everyday. So from simply stacking it and stepping it to hold kind of refined pieces of furniture. And then this, because it's this like really heavily scented wood, when you walk in, it's kind of, it's a really nice aroma. And that holds and contains kind of the display of clothes, through to kind of how you can joint them in with more complexity to kind of form other kind of furniture pieces, from staircases to bookcases and so on and so forth. And yeah, I think you get the point. But then to form these, and what was kind of a shame in the end was that we almost got them to burn every single plank of wood. So it would have been a very pure project. It was either kind of the cedar left out to protect the clothes, or you'd burn huge sections of the shop out. But at the last minute, it became too costly, so we had to abandon it. But the kind of staircase and material junctions. And then finally for this section, we just completed a concept gallery bookstore for Marion Goodman Gallery, which is a kind of private gallery who, you know, you should look them up. They represent some really quite fantastic contemporary artists. And we were asked to kind of, well, Marion Goodman herself has accrued a huge selection of quite rare art books. And she had this idea of both having a gallery at the back and then a bookstore, a kind of bookstore for rare artworks and rare editions at the front. And then there to be this tension where artists will be invited to put on an exhibition at the at the back, but then also kind of curate a selection of books to show what that influenced them throughout their lives. So it was quite a kind of bold move for them to take. But essentially for us, you know, we were kind of thinking like, how, it's in the Marais, it's in Paris, but we were on a really tight budget, and we were thinking like, how do you make a project out of a bookcase and a kind of table? So we started looking at the construction of a book, as it were, the spine, the bindings, these sorts of things. And then just kind of as a visual cue, we began realizing that it's like when you start to bend or fold metal, it starts to recall those profiles. And so the bookcase itself, we just treated like a piece, as you would a piece of architecture. We began thinking, well, the functional requirements are, it has to display books, it has to stand up, it had to be a self-supporting bookshelves. And essentially they became book spines, kind of facing the other way, to create alcoves for display and also functionally shelving. And these are the kinds of drawings that we're producing. So you can see these are the kind of columns, and then these are the expanded alcoves. And then we're kind of working in the workshop on kind of prototypes, just constantly kind of trying to refine the details. And then for a table, like how do you design a table to display books? And essentially it just became a book stand. So the profile of the book stand intersected the table, and then this became for a curated display of books, and then this became for, you know, stock, general stock. So there's a kind of prototype, and then the finished gallery. So the next section I called Elements of a Home. And I guess there are a number of themes or tropes. So this kind of starts to talk about how we've approached housing, or at first private residences, and then I'll show you at a larger scale. But essentially the first project was thinking about, well, it's actually an extension, a tiny extension. So I really wanted to talk about these small projects at the beginning. A tiny extension to a house, and at the front of the house there's this really beautiful kind of brook, stream kind of running through in Canonbury Grove. And we began kind of drawing the project out and thinking about how do you do a house, what is a house, and thinking about, the roots of the people that live there, the clients, and also kind of the roots of water, and thinking about how do you extend these things. And then we began thinking, and this is another thing that kind of happens in the office, we kind of look at huge, like grandiose scale projects like the Pantheon. And we were looking at Villa Lante, and kind of thinking, is it possible to imbue a tiny extension that's 6 square meters with the properties of these incredibly grand, kind of much larger, kind of either Renaissance or kind of ancient Roman, projects, I guess. And so the project is super simple. This is the existing house in the rear. They wanted to refurbish parts of it, but essentially it was to extend a small garden room, and then of course the garden room is itself defined by the garden. So it became a terrazzo extrusion, like a long extrusion that was excavated. So we kind of excavated out the garden, and then we began thinking how we could derive, derive a constructional language or detailing from this language. So, like I said, we used terrazzo, and what was kind of unique about this client was they were colorblind, so they couldn't see red and they couldn't see green. They saw everything as grey, which is kind of a really unique, kind of strange thing. And so we selected a terrazzo that had embedded within it kind of little red stones, little green stones, like all of this, but essentially within a field of grey, and it became a kind of, that material became a representation of the client, as it were. And we really studied the way, so we were kind of, this is the terrazzo being made and cast, and we thought it was really important to kind of think and document about the people, the processes of like how something is built. It's not that terrazzo, well, the traditional way is you kind of cast a slab and you pour terrazzo aggregate and you kind of sand it down, but then the kind of more contemporary construction methods. And then this is the kind of final extension, so you can see the kind of, we used the cut edge of the terrazzo to demarcate ground level, so everything below this was historically like in the earth, and this is historically above the earth. And then you can see the oculus, the kind of mirrored oculus that we're looking at, the Pantheon. And then the view out to the garden. So water became a really central kind of character within the work. And so this is a terrazzo urn, so water kind of spills out over the urn and then lands in 2 ponds, so it steps into 2 various ponds. And then it disappears into this planter and then reappears as a waterfall all the way down this edge. And then the final twist was that, in fact, the whole landscape is in fact a water feature. So you probably know that in England it rains all the time. So then we took all the drainage, we channeled all of the drainage in the garden to one single slot that marks the threshold between the interior and the exterior. So this was the 4th water feature, as it were. And then the last thing was that water was the only material that revealed kind of the terrazzo's true character. So it really looks grey, like incredibly grey, but then when you get it wet, it reveals the reds and the greens and the blues the client can't see. So we thought that was quite a nice kind of homage to them. And then, we were designing we didn't know how to do a light fitting in the ceiling, so we had to design a whole light fitting for them, which is kind of bespoke. The next one, which is kind of a refurbishment, so I should note that basically for young practices in London, a lot of projects have now just become refurbishments, because land is so hyperinflated in value that people don't do new builds so much anymore unless you're a really established office. So most young offices are refurbishing these sorts of properties. So this was the house itself. And then this is the approach towards that house. And the client really loved kind of this ascent. The reason she bought the house was she really loved this ascent to this, can you see this really steep staircase to this room, which is a tiny little room at the top, but it's a really quite nasty bathroom. But she saw potential in this, and she really, really loved it. And along that stair journey, you come across these moments where, you know, there's a window, and she really liked the fact that this was kind of damaged and never replaced, and these sorts of, I guess in English we'd say like the patina, like the way the property has patinated and aged, and how you see that and how you reveal that. And she wanted to do a project that was in dialogue with that didn't erase it, but somehow spoke to it. And there's this really beautiful kind of, in the lobby when you enter, this really beautiful cornice, like huge cornice, totally outscaled, that was quite incredible. And of course for us, we became really interested in just the stuff of the home. So like how a house has to be a home, right? Like the objects. And then thinking about kind of how we do a project, how we make a project out of this. And the client was kind of unique because she was trained not as an architect, but she studied spatial design. And she really loved, she kind of was unique. So she gave us the brief to work to this painting by Martin Creed. And she asked us to make a project from this. And she really loved this staircase, this ascent. And so, but we told her, if you love the stairs so much, you shouldn't really be replacing the stair, you should be reworking everything around the stair, but never touching the stair, and thinking about whether that can form the basis of a project. And then we began documenting all of the elements in a home. So just a really prosaic list from architrave, skirting, cornice, data rail, tread, riser, light fitting, everything, the stuff of the home. So always thinking about that first. And then we were looking at kind of two further artists, Brancusi and Cy Twombly, and we really liked this totem, these totemic structures and their presence. And so we began thinking, okay, well, there's the existing stair. Why not reform everything around it? And we realized that within her brief, we could do everything within one vertical stack. We'd renovate, of course, the whole property, but you could do everything within this one zone and then end up in this room. So we started off, you know, there's a drawing of the window. The first thing was to kind of insert an architectural element, which was a stele. So how a humble stele that's the most kind of ordinary piece of, ordinary piece of architecture in a way, or can be, just through a color can start to recall the things around it. Then we inserted 2 new windows, a window to the sky, and then this is actually a kitchen splashback, which is kind of, she was quite bold, quite brave. The cornice, and then finally a totem embedded within the house. And so you walk in and around this totem all the time to experience the property. This is it under construction. It's not finished yet, so that's the stele arriving on site. We really liked kind of this almost like religious cross. And then this is just the stele having been put in straight afterwards with a new kind of opening and the old rafters within the roof. So the stele just replaces one as it journeys up through the house. And then we also, this is the old stair that we were kind of replacing, and we really enjoyed she was thinking about, the house as a whole and like having lost these memories. The very things she enjoyed about the house were the missing stained glass window, the cornice, like these sorts of things. So we began thinking, okay, let's take the handrail. Let's take the handrail and let's cut out a small profile. And let's do every single piece of joinery in the house is cut from that handrail. So in a way, everything that you touch in the house is a latent memory of what was once there. So you feel the old house everywhere you go. And we thought that kind of latent kind of haptic memory throughout the house was a really, it was kind of in keeping with the project. So, we were kind of moving up in scale. So we were kind of shortlisted. We're in the final 4 to represent the UK in the Venice Biennale this year, which we didn't win, unfortunately. But essentially, what we were kind of looking at this point was housing, the problem of housing in the UK in the context of, you know, a housing crisis, which I'm sure maybe you're familiar with. If you're not, it's to do with kind of inflated land values, not enough being built every year for decades, and essentially people my generation not having access to housing. And in fact, it's too long a story to go into, but essentially what we kind of, within an office, there's a kind of frustration that we seem to be no more advanced than where we were 100 years ago, with the same sorts of crises, the same issues, the same politics, and thinking about how we as architects have a duty to respond to this, or how we evolve architecture to respond to this. So the reality of architecture in the UK is that everyone lives in these, 98% or something of housing is actually done by volume house builders without architects. So regardless of all our high-minded notions of talking about, you know, these architectural elements and how they speak of a biography of a person, the reality is everyone lives here in suburbia. And it's a terrain that is kind of, you know, it shouldn't be disparaged. It's, you know, I grew up in a house like this, John grew up in a house like this, and we were working with anthropologists called Daniel Miller, another one called Victor Buckley, an architect from Meccano, several kind of academic architects, and a guy called James Taylor Foster that a couple of you told me that you already know, to really examine this in a really unbiased kind of way, to think about why people actually want to live here. And what we thought was quite interesting was the fact that these were kind of covered in mock Tudor, kind of fake classical columns. You know, and at first our instinct was to laugh at it, to be like, this is so awful, it's so pastiche, like, do these people have no taste, kind of thing? But then in talking with the anthropologists, they were like, hang on, no, you're wrong here. The pursuit of character, you know, the anthropological discussion is that people desire these things and they can't afford these things quite often. And so they adopt them because they're looking for character. Yeah? And this is accessible. They can't afford a real classical column, but they don't want to live in something with absolutely no history. So in the way that we buy souvenirs and postcards, they decorate their homes. We thought this was actually quite an interesting moment in thinking about how we as architects think about buildings. And then kind of how people were originally going to the suburbs in the UK for this idealized image of the country cottage. Yeah? So like the image of these houses is based on a cottage. But then the space around, the space that you'd kind of traditionally sought became that. Yeah? And that is hugely desirable, because if you live in a detached home, it's much more valuable than if you live in a semi-detached home. That gap is probably more important than doing like a really beautiful double height space with light flooding in. It's kind of a real perversion. And then the fact that the suburbs were once kind of just for the middle classes who wanted to escape the squalor and labour unrest of the city centres, but now they're really filled with everyone. They're as complex as the city. You know? Like everyone from all different demographics, of all different ages, and thinking about how that housing typology has to evolve, both for catering for an aging population and also for a young who can no longer afford to live, you know, who can no longer afford to move out and live with their parents into their 30s, which is actually the case in the UK. It's kind of quite alarming. But then we really enjoyed the fact that, you know, it's a typology that people feel totally comfortable with, you know? Like they decorate it with this sort of thing, and you know, the iconic teenage bedroom, I don't know what your bedrooms were like, but kind of filled with stuff and posters, and it's a thing that actually makes a home. is when people feel comfortable to adapt it. And I think that that was a really kind of key kind of takeaway from this work. So recently, like in the last 4 or 5 months, we've been invited for quite, not huge competitions, but fairly substantial work competitions for buildings. And this is kind of a spreadsheet. This is kind of like how a lot of housing is done. And we were asked by the developer in this case, a kind of arts organization, whether we could build housing for less than affordable housing is built already today. So how can we build homes for cheaper than is basically most architects say it's impossible to build for, like, anyway. And we began looking at kind of the origins of kind of modern architecture, like Maison Domino by Corb, and thinking about, do we have to shed all of our kind of aspirations of what we want from a home and just start off with a shell? And just say, you know, you can't, rather than do bad apartments, why not try and rethink architecture from the beginning? So we began thinking by the shell. And then in a way that I was kind of talking about in the extension for the remodeling of the house and how an element can be inserted into a building to start to talk about biography, we began thinking, can we reimagine what a lift claw is, or a plant is, or a large shared table, or these sorts of things, and reimagine them so they become something extraordinary. So there's but somehow like with very economic means. And so we were talking a lot about kind of these photos, like the photographer Stephen Gill, how if you photograph and frame something, in this case scaffolding, it can, or if you view it obliquely, like within a reflection, actually there is some kind of intrinsic poetry to this. Like there can be poetry to something that most architects regard as throwaway, and it just requires a different eye at looking at it. And then on the old estate that we were due to replace, that we found this kind of quote, which we thought was really lovely, which was about someone who was living there, who said, the lifts, you could go halfway up a floor and you could force the door open and the lift would stop. Great place to have a kiss. And we really enjoyed the kind of way that people actually explore and inhabit architecture, or you just have to look at kind of filmic space or cinema to understand that the way that ordinary people think about architecture, or people think about architecture, is quite often misaligned to the way that we as architects design or cater for that. This is Trellick Tower, but we really enjoyed in London by Goldfinger. But what we really enjoyed was this kind of lift core, and then this plant room, and the potential of having kind of this huge stack with a viewing gallery over London. So essentially, one of the first drawings that we did for the project was this, which was looking at the site, the housing around it, which is designed by various architects already, and then thinking about how in a project like this, you just insert a few small judgments, like a really nice entrance, a shared table for communal dining, and reimagining the lift core as an observatory, or just so that it just pokes above the skyline and you see the whole of London, and how with just a few subtle tweaks, you can start to talk about community. So this actually we managed, so the build cost we were asked to aim for is about £1,800 per square metre, and we got the cost down to about £1,400, to give you a sense. So it's cheaper than cheap. But yeah, you can kind of see these sorts of things. And then in terms of housing, we began looking at how we all aspire to live here. It's kind of been a 20th century obsession of ours to live in the 2-bed apartment. And then gradually that became the 1-bed apartment. And then gradually that became the studio apartment. And now, well, the hotel suite kind of, we were kind of looking at other typologies as well. But now the reality for a lot of us is that we live in a bedroom in a house share or in a flat share, and we're 30 years old. It's kind of crazy. And so we began thinking, can we take this as the simple basic module? And can we think about kind of co-living and how we live together, to think about what a shared house can be, what a shared floor slab can be, these sorts of things. And then, anchored around these kind of shared spaces, this shared territory. And then thinking about the bedroom within a large kind of generous shell, and how then we collage that for everyday life. For the next housing proposal, it was for this site, and in fact, we find out whether we got it in about a week. So we're down to we're shortlisted to the last 4 architects. But essentially, the competition was for 4 sites, of which this is 1, and 30 units of housing. And as you can see, it's kind of to the back of all of those properties that kind of, I was talking about, make up the kind of the grain of the UK. And the problem was, it's obviously hugely overlooked and completely kind of landlocked. And we began thinking, how can we distill the things that we've been talking about so far into a strategy for this site? So first, it's an overlooked site, so you sink it. And we were talking, this is in collaboration with engineers and building services consultants. So they were saying, you know, anyway, for the soil conditions and for the foundations, we have to excavate that far. So we're just like, okay, great. You pull back the mass to create a kind of private gardens and a shared muse. We don't want to do apartments, we want to do houses. And then we began thinking about the elevation and thinking about the kind of history of this suburban type that both wants to be the farmer's cottage, no? Like here, so it's kind of terraced farmer's cottage, and also a terraced home, like the urban type of heavily dense urban dwelling. And then we began thinking how even the gap, you know, if we take the roof across here, how the gap within a roof profile can start to speak of the detached home. So it's both semi-detached, detached, and terraced. It's kind of thinking about, can we create a new image for suburbia that is dense enough to build? So this is the muse with the kind of long access to private gardens. And then one of the first images we did was a view from the neighboring property. And then we talked at length about how looking onto a roof of another building is a lot less imposing if it's kind of 15 meters away from you at the end of your garden than looking at a full facade. So we began thinking about, you know, starting with the community around it and the neighbors. This is the sunken muse with these kind of corner windows. And then really importantly, it was to not think about the house as a kind of completed product, as traditionally as architects we're taught. You kind of aspire for the perfect image of a home. But it's to kind of think about how people modify their houses to turn them into homes, or how they adapt their homes so that they can live in them for their whole life stage and kind of be an active member of their community. So in the existing scenario, you kind of take a 60 square meter house, and I'm sure you're familiar with the rear extension and the loft conversion. And the proposed scenario was to say, okay, let's give a really generous shell once again, a really kind of a home that's half finished, as it were, because it was about providing kind of access to housing that is, you know, people straight out of university can afford. And then you understand that they then complete it later. So they complete the rear extension, or they build in the second floor and party walls, and essentially go from a 50 square meter kind of studio flat to an 87 square meter 3-bed house, is the kind of premise. And how you can create an architecture that anticipates that change simply by casting the foundations on the party wall so that it can receive, you know, a new roof for extension, or having a lip on the interior that people can build off of just by going to a DIY store. And so these are the kind of, this is the constructional section that we're drawing up with the engineers. And then a view of the muse with the kind of corner windows. We thought, yeah, you can see the elevation of the corner windows. We even just left the drainage, we channeled all the drainage from the roof to a single point so that you just have this huge spout of water. We were like, you know, don't even bother finishing the drain. This is the shelf along the interior for people to kind of infill or build. And then all the finishes were really just, block work is self-finishing. Why finish it, And we were working with the developers to think about, it wasn't really a race to the bottom. It wasn't like saying, how do we do the cheapest piece of architecture? It's how can you do a piece of architecture that's really cheap, but also provides kind of compelling spaces. And even the garden walls between the developments we were showing is half height. So you don't even build them. And it's about instilling or engendering a sense of community. And so the final section, kind of ritual and routine. I guess part of our work is we're kind of commissioned by English Heritage, which is this historic buildings organization in the UK, to work with historians to reconstruct, like fictionally reconstruct ruined abbeys across London. Not London, across the UK. And so we kind of work with them to reconstruct the plans from the ruined landscape and remodel them and reconstruct them in every detail, and then produce these sorts of drawings and a whole set for each one. And every single detail is accurate. So like all of this stuff, the detailing of the clock, even I'm not sure if you can see it, but the kind of detail of what they call fictive masonry, where they painted on stone lines and ornament, but it was onto plaster rather than actually having stone construction. But then what we really enjoyed was their requirement that we drew the inhabitation and how people lived and the rituals and routines, and these lengthy discussions we'd have about how all of this orchestrated this. It was the most choreographed sort of architecture, with so many rules and codified language. And so we began trying to look for it in just the everyday, the banal. So this is a photo that we took of we master planned a festival in London, and this is it going up. And we really enjoyed this moment, this kind of collective effort or act of building something. And it reminded us of Iwo Jima, this like photograph of the American flag being raised. And we're having lots of discussions about whether that act of raising a flag is somehow a kind of embedded knowledge within us, kind of as from an anthropological discourse, whether the act of building is somehow as innate as kind of breathing. And then we began thinking about construction, and this is kind of leading on to a competition we did in America for where we came third out of 400 entries. It was for an area in Detroit. But looking at how the space of making something, the act of making something, it has somehow profoundly affected the way that we are able to build cities, to build architecture, and whether actually as designers we should be looking more at these processes. And so I don't know if you know this kind of this mural by Diego Rivera, but looking at the production line and within Detroit, making kind of cars, automobiles, and also how that spawned musical genres like Motown, and how even the act of making spawned a whole new kind of cultural movement in music. And so Detroit, I'm sure you all know, is kind of a city that's bankrupt, or declared bankruptcy a few years ago, and it had massive flight from the inner city centre towards the suburbs. It's that story again of suburbia, and it has huge amounts of vacancy because people just abandoned the inner city centre, and then gradually these have been dismantled. And the competition site was essentially this on the right. So this is on the other side. So if you've watched RoboCop, that's where it's set, in the GM headquarters, General Motors headquarters. And it was essentially to rethink this square as a kind of public kind of centre. So we began thinking about, so this is the aerial view, but we began thinking about how America is set out along a grid. Like all the cities of America kind of represent, how space has been appropriated and how the grid has become this kind of triumph in America of optimism over reality, you know, where everything can be parceled up along this kind of abstract construction. And then even that carries through even to the kind of logic of production and these sorts of landscapes. So this is the Ford Model T factory production. And then kind of anthropologically, our desire to raise flags, to put up markers, to claim space and to demarcate territories. Not walls, but first it's a flag or an obelisk or a stelae. And so the proposal became about leaving everything that was there actually intact. To say, no, you don't do tabula rasa, we don't do tabula rasa anymore, we don't erase everything, we rub it out. You know, we kind of railed against this notion that the first act of an architect is to erase the city that came before, but rather to say, no, you preserve it and you evolve that fabric. And so the proposal became a grid of these kind of flagpoles, markers, stelae, as it were, a canopy along the edge that was a kind of a permeable boundary to that public square. And then, essentially it's kind of that. And then where the canopy touched existing buildings, you'd appropriate them for civic buildings or arts galleries or these sorts of things. It was a very simple premise. But then the project really became about how these things were made. So taking the language of kind of steel, the automotive industry, we began suggesting that as residents and businesses returned to Detroit, they cast their own markers, their own stelae. And they kind of they create their own production factory in front of GM headquarters, and they forge their own kind of markers. And then they begin to raise them. And at first, you know, maybe it's just the one flag that gets raised, and it's just a symbolic marker, and they run out of money, and there's not the political will to do anything more. But then somehow it speaks of something. But if people do return to Detroit, you know, if they do return to the inner city, then they start to kind of speak with one another as a collective and transform and reclaim that kind of public realm. And it kind of had the capacity to hold, you know, everyone as they came back, I guess. And then within our images, kind of thinking about how we collage those elements and how we start off in the construction of a drawing, first drawing this, and then thinking about how it hits a roof or how a handrail dodges it, to this, where we kind of thinking back to the image I spoke to you of Aldo Rossi, or showed you of Aldo Rossi's, of the allegorical map of the city on the background, and then how that experience of these kind of columns frames your experience of Detroit. Here we began to enjoy this tension between, this is Corb's Maison La Roche, and then how it starts to recall kind of religious architecture or faith architecture, the pulpit, and we really enjoyed this tension. So for a refurbishment of a house, we're kind of extending the landing in quite a simple kind of literal way for a young family, because they were talking about their kid growing up, and then we were thinking about how kids kind of interact with their parents. And yes, there's an understanding that they need to meet and eat at the dinner table, but quite often teenagers just scream at their parents from upstairs, and this became a balcony for that. And it kind of framed it and positioned it at the top of the room, that kind of really everyday act. And then thinking about kind of neighborliness and these sort of like small architectural details that actually give us cues to how we kind of live and occupy in space and how we behave, and how an architectural detail can actually, I guess, give cues to us for how to behave. We can't necessarily we shouldn't really master plan people's lives or be too didactic, but just by dropping a wall to a neighbor's garden and having a barbecue, it can speak of something social. Or by kind of having a slight camber to a party wall, you can start to kind of encourage the most neighborly of interactions, you know, the chat over the garden fence. So this project, incidentally, was we were asked to look at a strip of kind of garages to the back of these really handsome historic properties and to kind of rethink them. And we were basically saying that the street is actually quite beautiful because all of the greening from the private gardens gives character to that street. So we said the intervention should only be kind of a single story, and you should inscribe the whole site with a garden wall, and then set behind, again it was affordable housing, but set behind courtyard houses that look on kind of the transverse axis. So this became the kind of garden wall, and you'd have windows onto private gardens, or doorways, or windows, or bay windows, and kind of you'd hide the car parking behind it. This is the kind of courtyard types. And then thinking about the sidedness of a wall and the life of a street, and how you can then, like through this kind of these apertures at ground level, how you can start to create a street. And then, so we were kind of creating these collages quite early on in the office. And then we began thinking about how you document a project. And instead of showing kind of really idealized visions of kind of perfect, magazine-like quality, photographs, we're really enjoying these sorts of things. So this is actually the photographer we're working with, usually as a fashion photographer. And when he was kind of photographing our master plan, we really enjoyed these sorts of moments. And then it became a really useful vehicle for thinking about how, when we do other projects, kind of we start thinking about them being their inhabitation and these sorts of things. So there's this constant, I guess, feedback mechanism in the work. And so finally, I thought I'd end on this project, which was for Campo Space in Rome, who the founders previously did, are doing a publication called San Rocco in Tandem. And we began thinking about kind of us as architects and what we do as designers, and thinking about the whole life cycle of a building. So what I'm going to show you is kind of just 10 drawings that begin to explore that. So the first was thinking about kind of, we call Genesis, which is thinking about the first act of building and the landscapes that we leave behind. So this is a quarry. This is called Metamorphosis, which is, I guess, tying back to the title of the lecture, transubstantiation. So the moment that you remove something from a natural landscape and it transforms its identity and it becomes a building element. Yeah? So that singular moment. What we as architects do, so this is what we call translation, and how this is the space of design. So we stop thinking, some architects think about it, but predominantly this is the space that we work in. And we work in this kind of codified language of CAD and digital space now. And somehow we've forgotten about these spaces, the implications of what we leave behind. This is the kind of construction site, so we call this birth, but then also the kind of images of architecture that we kind of veil those construction sites. And it's kind of funny, we were kind of talking about how it's a kind of unseen thing. It's a bit like, giving birth in reality to a child. It's somehow veiled and unseen, and there's an idealized image or projection of what we want on it. And this kind of obsession to hide that. And then the actual life of a building. So not just catering for, these, I'm sure you've kind of seen these renders with like really happy children with balloons and these sorts of things, but how buildings are also for these people, no? Like the people that are kind of cleaning it, and who are we designing for? Like, how do we think about design? What's the life of a building, as it were? And then finally, so our architects were very bad at thinking about this, the future life. And then we virtually never think about this, no? Like with our designs, which is kind of the death of a building. And then we began to kind of speculate about how we perceive the city from, how this becomes the memory. There's a kind of tragedy when we start to destroy bits of city to make room for new development. But we began to speculate. In England, or in London, a lot of the spoil is sorted, and all the waste that can't be sorted gets taken down the river, the Thames, to Essex. So we began thinking of it as a kind of funeral, a kind of procession of kind of building matter. And then speculating about how, instead of these things being thrown, or these kind of codified architectural elements that tell us so much about our history, it kind of, in layman's terms, this literally, when we destroy something, this in 100 years becomes archaeology. But until that point, we kind of throw those sorts of things away. It's less this, but this. And then finally imagining a situation where, most of our rubbish, in the UK at least, ends up back in the landfill. So these then get filled up with rubbish. And imagining a potential new landscape that becomes a kind of what we called a reliquary, it's a kind of a museum. And it was based on one of Piranesi's drawings of kind of ancient artifacts arranged on a cliff. But essentially, we were drawing iPhones in with architectural elements, kind of thinking of Aldo Rossi's drawing, and then thinking about how all of this kind of overwhelming mass of stuff is actually architecture. All of the thrown away redundant stuff that we destroy tells us about our kind of history and our shared kind of human experience. And I guess our job as designers is maybe not just to think about this, but to think about all of these stages and how we imbue these things with new meaning. And I guess that for us, or for our office, is design.
Thank you, Hikaru, for your very interesting lecture. Are there any questions? We are a shy city, sorry. Okay, so allow me to ask you a question, because it's hopeless a bit. We saw that you're very much into detail, you as an office, and I was just wondering if the reason or the fact why it's possible is, as you said, that you're working in very humble scale, or if you could possibly imagine that you could keep this sort of workflow also in some much larger scaled projects.
Yeah, I hope so, and I think that all this has enabled us to do is kind of to distill, I guess, some sense of architectural value. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that that's a methodology as such, but it's an appreciation of architecture. So the fact that we've had to rework a lot of existing buildings, that previous architects had designed, has become, I guess, has really shaped our appreciation and understanding of architecture and of the city, and how you do an architecture that is in dialogue with the city.
Anyone?
I have a question. If you have you ever experienced that your building or your work was afterwards decorated or changed by client? And
yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, but yeah, it's like I said, it's a real shame that when we were kind of younger, we didn't photograph. We were always looking for that very pure space, or just documenting our intervention. And I think now it was a mistake, and it would have been much more interesting kind of showing, the apartment with the veneer, for example, with just the everyday stuff of the home. And we become a lot, so this has been a kind of evolving discourse in the office over the last 6 years, but we've become a lot less precious about capturing an idealized vision of a project, or thinking that as architects what we design is a finished product that is like here and it exists for one moment in time in a perfect state, and then it decays from that point. It's actually thinking, that what we do is we catalyze the building, or catalyze a certain circumstance, and then yeah, we're very open to them cutting it up, carving it up, changing it. Yeah. I'd be disappointed if they didn't. Because I think that if you build an architecture that doesn't accept change, I think what happens is it gets destroyed. If you can't adapt a building for a certain use or for a new use, it gets destroyed. So I think that building in kind of adaptability is actually an essential component as an architect. Like that's what we should do.
These collages that you are showing us, you are also showing to your clients, right? Like
yeah.
The images of your project. So I'm curious, like, how are you communicating these images to your clients? Because I think mostly architects are forced or put in a place they have to create images of their projects that they're not satisfied with. Like, I mean, like these photorealistic renderings and stuff that you really don't want to do, but you have to do it because of the client. So
I think we've surrendered too much ground, actually, in that regard. Because these photorealistic renders, you know, what we're trying to do is capture a finished product, no? And a lot of students, certainly so where we teach and where we've kind of critted or examined, kind of seek this idealized image of a project from the moment they start designing. And what we've forgotten is that great architecture didn't have that before, no? And yet we could still do great buildings. And is to understand that representation is not the representation of a finished product. That space of drawing is about exploring a thought. It's about capturing a thought. There should be a creative anxiety, like when you start a drawing, that it's completely unknown, that you don't want it to be photoreal. And I think we're quite fortunate that the clients that we do have, which have tended to be up until now kind of cultural institutions, but now and private individuals, and now I guess people are kind of responding to the work, and it's now about kind of, yeah, I don't know, housing and these sorts of things. And I guess, yeah, it just depends on how you as an office or as an architect decide to talk about your work or to sell it. So if you sell it about this idealized view from the corner of a street, then probably the client will want to see exactly what you mean by that. But if you talk about it in different ways, or you introduce it in a different way, and you say there's a struggle that isn't, you know, a photograph of a project, it's in the plan, you know, it's in a plan form or it's in an architectural detail, then by and large, the clients that we've had, touch wood, have responded to that.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is if any of those housing projects specifically were put into reality, and if so, if the ideas for the communal spaces were appreciated by the people as you were thinking they would
so
be.
Those housing projects are kind of really hot.
If some of them were put into reality, if they were built already, and if so, if the ideas specifically you've addressed for the community space, like the.
So as I said, both of those projects are recent competitions in the last 3 months. So next week or the week after, I have an interview. We're in the last 4, basically, for the last housing project that we showed. And actually now in London, there's a real appetite for looking at co-housing. And I think across Europe, actually, as a kind of condition, like certainly in Germany and these sorts of places. And yeah, I think there's an appetite for it, for sure. And I think it's born from crisis, actually, the fact that we don't know where we're housing a whole generation.
Okay, once again, thank you, Hikaru, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for coming and for your lovely questions. And I assume Mr. Architect will be around this event and probably also on the after party. So I'll speak for you, but I mean, feel free to ask him whatever comes to your mind. thank you for coming, and thank you for you for coming as well.